Okay, so thank you all for coming to this third and final session in the workshops, the LOESS workshops on developing a competency map for education for soil health. You're all very welcome. We have our expert panel joining us as well. And just to say, this is being recorded. We discussed that anyway, and it will be shared on the LOESS website. So we have the students in the room as well, and our expert panel are here to kind of share their views with us. Joining us online, we have Professor John Barry and we have Dr. Ry Locke, and Karen Kerr will be joining us as well. Dr. Karen Kerr, who you'll remember also was in the first panel, so she's bracketing the session, she's opening and closing. So we're going to make a start with John. Professor John Barry describes himself as a recovering politician, and he also describes himself as an increasingly impatient professor of green political economy here at Queen's in Belfast. He's impatient for real climate change and the transition to a low-carbon, post-growth economy and society, and he is also co-chair of the Belfast Climate Commission and indeed in many, many other commissions and various bodies, John, I know, but we won't go into them all. So could I hand over to you first, John, and then we'll come to you, Ry, and we'll finish with Karen.
That's great. Thank you, Emma, and good afternoon, everybody. As Emma described, I'm not your normal academic because I think the times we live in are not normal. And indeed, Callum and myself have written and got involved in organising academics across the island of Ireland in terms of how do we change in the academy in terms of what we teach, how we teach, whether or not the knowledge and competencies we're imparting and co-creating with our students are appropriate. And our answer is at the moment, no, that the world is on fire. We have an increasing nature deficit, a depletion of our soils, increasing food and energy insecurity, geopolitical tension as a result of that. We're only going to see things get worse, in my view, before they get better. And that would include, given the day that's in it, with your boy being installed across the way in Washington, where we're going to see doubling down on the burning of fossil fuels, which are only going to add pressure on the climate crisis, which is going to result in even more climate refugees. So I'm telling you this not to scare you, but that is simply the science as I'm reading them. And indeed, it's one of the issues that I think we need to, in the academy, as lecturers, as researchers, as teachers, and indeed as students, to be mindful of how overwhelming all of this can be. I mean, I never thought as a teacher that I'd have to do what I've been doing for the past number of years on the courses that I teach, where I put trigger warnings on my modules, because I realized that just even that brief summary I've just given you there, I mean, that can be overwhelming and absolutely terrifying for a young person. So I think there's an emotional dimension to understanding the climate and ecological crisis that we absolutely have to recognize. And I'm afraid we're not doing a very good job of it at the moment within the academy. So that's the first thing I would say. In terms of a more, if you like, I've given you the deconstructive, the kind of critical perspective, and that to me is all science-based. You know, this is simply a reading of the science in terms of what we're facing. So what do we do about it? Well, I think in probably the best bit of her presidential campaign, the defeated candidate Kamala Harris, the best bit of her campaign was her concession speech, in my view, where she said, now is not the time to throw up our hands, but to roll up our sleeves. You know, let's not, you know, become so overwhelmed that we become paralyzed or become cynical, or we look away from the problems that we have to face. And how can we do that? Whether it's looking at soil health, whether it's looking at the transition away from fossil fuels, whether it's looking at, you know, how utterly vulnerable our global economy is in terms of our long supply chains, you know, often based upon fossil fuels. How do we address that? Well, I think the first thing we need to do is to have a very full-on and explicit interdisciplinary approach. There is no one discipline or knowledge base that's going to help us get out of this crisis. we are going to need physicists as well as philosophers, political economists such as myself, as well as, experts in pedagogy and education, chemistry, as well as sociology. We're going to need all these disciplines to work together in terms of looking at different aspects of the problem. And the reason for that is the second issue. So as well as interdisciplinarity, so to have an understanding of how different disciplines connect into whether it's energy, food, soil, is a connection with another I of intersectionality. And what I mean by that is that there's an element in which we need a systems approach to see how the food system intersects with the energy system, intersects with the economic system, intersects with the policy or governance system. We cannot just simply look at a single problem. We have to see how we need this systemic view, which I'm calling here an intersectional view. And the second reason why I call for an intersectional view is that we can't just have a science-based, technocratic, fact-based analysis and transition or how we deal with this. What I mean by intersectionality here, and some of you perhaps who've studied social science, sociology, or politics, is the issue of justice. We have to see how the causes, the consequences, and the solutions to the climate and ecological crisis, are unevenly distributed by class, by race, by geographical position. And therefore, we need to have an understanding that justice must be always part and parcel of our analysis, even when it comes to solutions, because some of the solutions, say, for example, a carbon tax, that's often seen as a policy solution. You increase the price of carbon and that decreases its use. And that is true, but unfortunately, it's an extremely regressive policy because it hurts the poorest as well as the richest. So in other words, even some of the solutions that we're seeing being proposed actually have negative injustice impacts. Never mind them when it comes to some of the more grandiose and science fiction, and in my view, very, very scary kind of, technological approaches of geoengineering and so on, which have extremely regressive and justice implications. Where are we really going to hand over the solution to the ecological and climate crisis to a bunch of white tech bros in California, where the imperialist countries, where most of us probably listening to me live in the global north, the countries that gained and succeeded on the back of colonization and imperialism, that these countries are now going to control the technologies that are going to solve the climate crisis. So that's the second reason why I think we need an intersectional approach to have those dimensions of justice across space, in terms of global justice, indeed across time. What are the intergenerational impacts of the decisions we now make? And even, I'll just throw it out there in terms of this intersectional justice approach, to look at the non-human world. What are the impacts on the more than human world? What are our obligations to the more than human world as we understand these complex set of issues of the climate and ecological crisis? And I think partly for many of us who probably maybe not heard that perspective before of going beyond human-centeredness, that sounds a bit odd. And that's why we need another I. So I've already talked about interdisciplinarity, intersectionality. My third I is imagination. We absolutely need to be encouraging that creative, imaginative approach to understanding these issues, which sometimes, for example, means we should read a lot more poetry, more fiction, and not just science and fact-based information and knowledge, important as they are. And I think that's part of the problem often with our education system, certainly within the academy, is that we're not playful enough, we're not imaginative enough. And certainly I think we need in the academy, again, in terms of our research and education, to be bringing in artists, singers, dancers, finding, popular culture as a way of analyzing the problems that we're facing and also provide potential solutions. And I also think in terms of particularly teaching to young people, our students, we have to connect what we're teaching to their lived experience. Too often the knowledge that we often impart to students doesn't really bear any connection to their lived experience, their aspirations for the future. And that's why connecting what we're doing to the lived experience of students, to show them, for example, that from farm to fork, You know, everything is in my view, an energy story. You know, we can't understand the degradation of the soil without saying that that has to do with energy and the particular industrial, chemical, agricultural system we've had, particularly over the last 70 years. And that then's connected, in my view, to capitalism, to a particular mode of production in which, you know, we see profit making as the primary aim, and it's less regenerative than it ought to be in terms of sustainability demands. And I think for me that would then lead to, it is a competency, but it's also an ethos and a way in which we should be talking about these issues between teachers and students, is the democratization of knowledge production, particularly with our students, opening up the space whereby democracy shouldn't end at the lecture room door or the seminar room door. We should be opening the opportunities for students, for them to decide, or at least part decide in a module, for example, what is it they want to learn about. You know, definitely, I think maybe this will require, you know, some pre-socialization and encouragement for students so that they can decide, well, why don't we look at, you know, this issue, which the lecturer may not have considered as well. And again, that is something that certainly is part of my own teaching practice in terms of democratizing education, because that's where we can open up imagination. We can value the lived experience of our students who may not have all the technical knowledge yet, but they certainly know what it is they're interested in negotiation with the expert or the researcher. And I do think that requires competencies in our students of confidence to be able to say, I'd like us to look at this issue for this reason. It does involve, often in my experience, some degree of negotiation between students themselves and the lecturer. That's all good skills you need for any walk of life after your education. And particularly in that ethos of democratizing how we learn about these issues, we have to encourage the resolution of conflict and clashes of values, of worldviews. We shouldn't be shying away from people having different views, whether it's based on values or a different reading of the facts. And therefore, that leads us then to seeing that conflict transformation, which to my mind is going to be an absolutely necessary part of how we need to think about whether it's dealing with soil health and we move to agroecology, somewhere between, you know, organic and industrial agriculture. You know, in the context of the island of Ireland that many of you be aware of, we have a major problem because our biggest greenhouse gas emitting sector is not energy or transport, as it is in many other European countries. It's land use and agri-food. And we begin to see already how we have this farmers versus the climate narrative already in the real world in Ireland, North and South. Now, to me, that requires a conflict transformation process, you know, a recognition of differently held values, maybe a misreading sometimes of the science, or a deliberate misreading in order to provoke and excite a particular section of our community to be against policies. And that's the reality, in a way, of what I often call the dirty politics of clean energy transition. That we have to, you know, recognize that there's some bad faith actors out there that are very powerful, often economic interests and organizations who are threatened by a transition to a more regenerative, low carbon energy, post fossil fuel economy. And we have to recognize that and find ways of either negotiating and coming to an agreement, or avoiding them and bypassing them in a way to try and get to where we want to in terms of a sustainable, low carbon, regenerative economy. And just to finish, in all of this, the aim should be the inculcation of realistic hope for the future. Again, to loop back to where I began in terms of the emotional or psychological dimension of this, which we don't often talk about. We need to absolutely instill in our students, and indeed amongst ourselves as researchers, a sense of realistic hope. Now, what I would call unrealistic hope is the kind of a tech optimistic view that somehow there's an app or that somehow there's a whiz-bang technology is going to solve all of these problems. While we certainly will need technology, we will more than that need structural changes to the way our food system works, how our energy system works, and indeed how our economy works, which to me, just to give you the kind of summary version of my own analysis after 30 years of researching this, is that there is no capitalist solution to the crisis we're facing. So the solution has to be beyond capitalism. Now, what we call it doesn't really matter, but it cannot be this growth-based economy, about the commodification of more and more areas of our lives, including now the colonization of our attention through social media. So I think we need a post-capitalist understanding of where we're going to. And that means then we're talking about a post-growth economy. You know, hands up, anybody in the room, does your heart sing whenever you hear GDP growth in Ireland or Northern Ireland or the UK has increased? For most people, growth is meaningless. What we want are good jobs, good food, decent public services. What if we can have those things without going for growth? And so there's an issue here that a post-capitalist, post-growth perspective is one that we need to encourage. And again, that requires imagination, it requires courage, it requires challenging maybe inherited views that we may have, for example, of the good life. You know, what does the good life look like in a regenerative post-carbon economy? And that's the last issue, which is the easiest one. While, you know, we can argue about whether or not post-capitalism, post-growth and so on, we absolutely need to move to a post-fossil fuel-based economy. We simply cannot have a livable world if we continue to burn fossil fuels. But unfortunately, Donald Trump didn't read my memo. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. Even if you haven't cheered us up with the talk of what's happening in the US, I think some of us have been successfully avoiding that all day. Thank you so much for that. And indeed, that kind of point about how do you engage and involve students and how do you encourage people to have hope in what can feel like a hopeless situation is something that is really, really important. Sorry, I am just going to pin Ryan now to the screen so that we can see her properly. And just to say to you, Karen Kerr has joined us in person as well. So, you know, yeah. Oh, yeah, driving, obviously. So thank you very much for joining us, Rachel. So Dr. Rachel Locke is a lecturer in education at Manchester Institute of Education, obviously in the University of Manchester. Her main research interest is in the practice of environmental education, but she's also a passionate advocate for soil health, and in particular does a lot of work with the Manchester Environmental Education Network, and is, I think, the main lead person in it. So she's going to speak to us a little bit about her work both on the education side and on the practitioner side, because I know you probably have a foot very firmly both sides. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Just
Thank you.
Sure we can hear you when you speak.
Yeah, can you hear me okay? Is that all right? Yeah. So yes, I'm a lecturer at the University of Manchester, but I'm also I run a small charity, and the charity delivers environmental education to young people in urban environments. And one of the projects I want to talk a little bit about means projects, particularly our soils projects. And then I want to talk a little bit about how that connects to my work in the university as well. So there is actually on the LOESS website, there is actually one of our case studies up there. But we've been working with soils for a number of years. And the way that we function is we tend to have a project which we say we're going to deliver to, say, 3-6 schools, and get funding to do this, and then try and work a project up that really makes sense to the people in the school, so it supports what they're doing, but also adds a new dimension. There's a lot of intergenerational work that we do. And we also work quite closely trying to think about it in terms not just of learning, which is generally what happens in a primary school. You do a lot of learning, but we also want all our projects to embrace that idea of taking action. So it's about doing things. And I think actually talking about realistic hope, as you were, John, I really think that taking actions and being responsible for those actions doesn't just deliver hope, it actually puts things into practice and makes it very real. So we're keen always to embed the learning. And then it's about sharing that information, and that builds confidence, and it tends to help young people think things through more deeply. Suddenly they are the experts. So they then need to be able to answer questions of adults, of other children, and get them right and feel confident. So with this latest round of our project, it's called Sustaining Soils. I start off the process by asking the children what it is they're interested in. So I don't know whether if I hold this up, whether anyone can see that. Oh, back to front, lovely, but it actually it says, do you want to visit a laboratory? And what we do is we try that. I mean, that came out top. A lot of these young people are disaffected, but the idea of going into a university, into a laboratory, and being able to work within that laboratory for an afternoon is something that got them very excited. It's something they'd never done before. It's something unusual. So they voted to do that. We also asked if they wanted to go to an organic farm. They really wanted to do that. Whether they wanted, we were talking about creativity as well. Imagination. We asked them whether they want to do some work with clay, and that's actually a really useful little tool for getting them used to working with soil. In an urban environment, soil is often thought of as dirt. It's something that you try and avoid. It's something that makes your clothes dirty, so your mum isn't happy and you have to get the washing machine on. So actually trying to get that contact with soil is one of the first steps. And for some children, that's quite traumatic. And actually, when we talk about living soil and start revealing all the creatures that live in the soil to the children, equally, that can be a bit traumatic. But it can also be really insightful and exciting because suddenly they know about something that a lot of adults don't know or haven't realised. So we'll use little hand held microscopes, and the children will interface with adults showing them what they've found and what they've learned. We might do an archaeological dig. We might grow green fertilizers. We'll start composting. We'll start working on improving any areas of soil that are perhaps rubble. In a lot of inner city schools, we have a lot of really, really bad, poor soil. We might make leaf mold. We'll explore soils as habitat. We're going to be doing some soil listening. So I have a PhD student and a friend who has a microphone that you can put into the soil. You can work out what creatures you're listening to and put that into a soundscape because he's a soundscape artist. So if we're thinking about competencies, I really would recommend in terms of education for sustainability, there's a website called A Rounder Sense of Purpose. And it's an EU funded website, and it's talks about all the different competencies that might be involved in education for sustainability. And obviously you need to instill values. How you go around instilling values is interesting in itself. For example, if we're trying to democratize, we really need to make sure that we do it properly and that young people are able to engage, vote, change their minds, that you adapt. If we're talking about something like future thinking, to me, future thinking is very much about what we do now. we can imagine the world in terms of having fantastic, healthy soil in an urban situation. But then how do we get there? It's about planning. It's about putting in the systems that will help that soil recover. So one of the main activities that I will do with any of the schools that I work with, I'll have a small group of children and we'll work closely together. We'll think about how we're going to improve soil, what we're going to do to it, how we're going to bring wood chip in, whether we're going to buy our own compost in order to build things up quickly. So there are all sorts of different ways of going about making sure that what we're doing is actually improving a situation. If we think about criticality, I think that's another really important skill. We really need to be able to think through our problems, work out why things aren't working. And often in schools, it's because if you're working with young people, they often don't hold the power. So you always get this gap in relation to their agency. So you really need to make sure that you've got other people on board, staff, the head. You really have to get them on board. Being made responsible for something is important. In one of the schools that I worked in recently, they started composting. The kids totally in charge of collecting all the fruit waste. They love being responsible for it. But then they also enjoy the responsibility of deciding what to do with the compost once it's made. So it's about taking it. If we're talking about systems thinking, when we're teaching, we actually need to use systems thinking skills in order to make sure that what we're delivering covers the full breadth of experience from learning right through to taking action. And collaboration, that's another really important aspect of this, getting people working together. So many different ways that you can approach soil. It might be through growing, it might be through just focusing literally on, say, peat up on the moorland. We have quite a lot of that in Northern England, up on the hills. So there are different ways that you can approach it. But I think you have to remember that in order to develop empathy, we have to make sure that we also deal with people's fears. So there are a number of instances where children are afraid of spiders and worms, and they don't want to touch soil. How do you actually find the time to go through a process of slow education and familiarization with a world that a lot of young people feel very cut off from? And it does take time. And I think that one of the reasons why mean projects tend to work is because we don't do a one-off. We will go in week after week and support them. So I'm just going to turn to HE now, and the MA that I work for is in Education for a Sustainable Environment. And what I've done is I've tried to take some of the learning from some of the experiences and the learning from working in schools, whether it's high schools, primary schools, and take that with me into this MA so that the young people can mix with the students. So, for example, recently we had a group of students go and visit a local school where they had been growing food, looking after the soil, growing green fertilizers, and they were talking about the clover that they'd planted. And then another group of children also ran climate change activities for another group of students. So it's about getting those engagements going so that we can learn from each other. But also it's about just taking our time. I'm talking 10 to the dozen here. And that's what we tend to do as academics. It's like we want to get our information, we want to impart it to you. It means we don't have time to stop and study really closely what's going on in our world. And I think that attentiveness, paying attention to things, being able to look at the small things as well as the large things, we might talk about that as lived experience as well. Because often we walk through our world and we miss so many details. And when you start to really look closely at soil, a whole new world is revealed. And I think it's about time. It's about slow education as much as it is anything else. Making those emotional connections are really important. And I think that if we're really trying to engage people in a love of soil, they do need to see a full process, how they can make soil, how they can improve soil, how they might be able to eat the food from that, or how the tree looks more healthy because of what they've done. And I think that although we might think of competencies as things that we want to sort of go, oh, yeah, I'll tick that competency off because I've achieved that and I've achieved this. And actually, it's about taking time, finding out from whoever it is that you're working with what they've learned and responding to their interests. So sometimes voting is good, but you also need to really listen closely to what people like, what they don't like, what they're interested in. Curiosity grows out of what we know and trying to fill the gaps in around what we know. And learning how to care for something like soil is a big challenge, but we all know how important it is. And I'd like to actually just say, one of the books that I would really recommend, and this is partly inspired by what you were talking about, John, about the fact that we need to think about our economic system. I would really recommend reading Kimura's The Service Tree, because she's kind of talking about very small actions, but she's pointing out the fact that the way that we live, we do give to each other, we do share food. It's not all about competition, and that we can find ways in our lives, like the Indigenous peoples used to do in their communities, where we don't think of our livelihoods as being to do with economics and monetary things, but much more to do with people, to do with community, and to do with sharing. And I think that food, soil, and all those associated aspects can help us do more of that. Anyway, I think I've probably talked for longer than I should. I'd like to share the time now.
Thank you so much for that. That was fascinating. And I mean, I think we could also see the line between the kinds of things that you're doing and the kinds of things that John is saying he wants to see in students, the negotiation skills, the thinking, you know, voting's one end of a scale, as you say, but if you have a sense you're being listened to, you're much more likely to negotiate, you know? So it's that thing of starting to build the skills in. Thank you so much for that. I think that was absolutely fascinating. And I would like to invite Karen Kerr now to come up. Yeah, sure. Yeah, we're going to sorry, we're going to put up, Karen's got a presentation. So Karen, we're very lucky to have her return for this panel. She spoke in the first panel. As you'll remember, Karen's a lecturer here in education, in the School of Education, and teaches on the postgrad certificate science to student educators. She's passionate about soil education as well, and has done a lot of work on the impact of outdoor education and outdoor learning with children and young people. And she's on the board of Northern Ireland Environment Link, particularly involved in the Education for Sustainable Development Forum. So Karen, or you could try setting it to me on Teams if you want, and I could open it.
Would that work better?
Well, I don't know. What do you think? But that's
No, I don't know. I don't mind.
you're okay to put it on. Okay, I'll hand over to you. I always forget my agile lectures are these things. You just pop up.
I don't know about that. But then, do you have a pen drive?
It's done.
But you're connected through this,
Yeah,
and it'll go in, will it?
I presume so.
That's
Yeah.
right. Okay. Let's see. Let me close this one up. Let me open it. All right.
Okay.
Oh, well, that sounds.
There you go.
That sounds good. There we are. I think it's all right. Session. There we are. So good. Go. Done. Right, there we are. I don't want any help. Thanks. Okay. It should just let me current slide. There we are. Okay. Hello, everybody. So it's actually nice to be here in person. So apologies for the delay. In order to be here in person, I took a drive from a school in the middle of nowhere to get back on time. So apologies for my tardiness. Hopefully the people online can hear me okay, can they? Yeah.
Can you hear okay, John?
If they can. Or continue talking.
I wonder.
You can hear okay.
Oh, good. There we are. Just checking. So I suppose I talked about this the last day, and I wanted to pick up from here. So this would be one of the documents really that has led my journey with ESD in the programs that I teach on, but also in terms of advocating for an ESD pedagogy, I suppose, in every other sort of network, community of practice, wherever else I kind of go, and internally and externally in the university. And my thinking has really developed through actually a professional training program the Queen's internally offered around leadership in ESD. So I thought that was quite timely. So I think a lot of us are doing little pockets of things, and we're very committed to ESD, so I'll being a part of that. But it was good maybe to be involved in something that's university-wide, that made me think about maybe other subjects where an ESD pedagogy doesn't lend itself on first appearance, as being able to sort of to be able to integrate fully an ESD approach, I guess. So there's colleagues from, you know, psychology, engineering, biological sciences, and then there's myself, who's very much so education. It's always been something very natural for me because I'm a biology educator, so you can see, you know, the links are quite natural there. If you're training biology teachers, why wouldn't you take them outside? It wasn't really happening, but it is now. And why wouldn't you have people connecting and understanding what it's like then, and preparing people to take young people outside, so that ripple effect can be quite big, actually. And addressing those things like, it's all right for your shoes to get dirty, it's fine, we're doing biology, we can do this. But I suppose we need to think bigger than that now, and that then has influenced some of my further work in sort of what are the broad competences that we want to develop as students, right from, you know, foundation babies and their mud kitchens, I've taught there as well, nursery, primary one, right through then to children progressing through primary school and through big school, and then on into university in whatever program. So some of the umbrella things you might want to think about are things like thinking skills and personal capabilities. This is probably familiar to some of you if you were educated here in second level in our secondary schools. This is a framework that has been embedded in the curriculum now for many, many years. So those bigger things, and education for sustainable development lends itself here in terms of the development of skills frameworks in our young people, and again in higher education as well. Nobody can argue that all of these thinking skills and personal capabilities are important, and we can overlay sustainable development and soil education to all of these, really. It wouldn't take much to rework some learning outcomes to ensure that ESD is the focus here. Then, as I've just talked about, the things that lend themselves naturally. So these are future science teachers, Northern Ireland for secondary level, and now it's mandatory under our programme. So I didn't take no for an answer. So now everyone is outdoors, everyone is learning outdoors, and it's not necessarily just biology. So we talk about the cross-curricularity, we talk about numeracy, we talk about poetry, actually, John. We talk about our natural heritage, we talk about you know, some of the writings that have come from a long time ago, where people write about the woods. You know, even some of the war poems are very, very nature-based as well. So we talk about all of that. We talk about numeracy, and we talk about economy as well when we're outdoors. The bottom right there is a visit to one of the wind farms, and we've expanded now to the chemistry and physics students as well, who are going to go out and teach chemistry and physics and maths a lot of the time too. So that expansion is happening quite naturally. So now it's about influencing others to ensure that that happens even more broadly beyond just the sort of bog standard subjects that you think that lend themselves. And this has led me to do some work then with someone who does the same job as me, but in Dublin. So she's also training secondary level science teachers as well. And we wanted to start with what we know, but then now it is growing in terms of our analysis of what's happening at secondary level for people coming into higher education. And what we're finding is that curriculum and specifications, the place of nature, including soil, it's just not there. It's not there in the specifications. And then we're expecting people to pick this up as a natural part of what they do when they arrive at higher education. So we're in the middle of quite an in-depth specification and curriculum analysis. And we've started with the one subject that you would think there would be a lot of that, and there's not. There's just not. So our findings are quite stark. So this is in press at the minute, so you're getting it hot off the press. It's with the reviewers. It's already been accepted. It's a special issue. And it actually ties. When I came in the door, John was talking about this. I was like, oh my gosh. So this will be published in Irish Education Studies. And we're looking very much with that whole capitalism and economy drive. And we've really tried to simplify it to show that it is possible to have an eco-pedagogy regardless of your subject. Because if you're doing economy, if you're doing finance, if you're doing management, if you're doing leadership, if you're doing psychology, this all has an impact. And what we're trying to say is at the minute, everything that we're doing is quite anthropocentric. Even on secondary level biology specifications, it's the human and animal focus, and it has its place. We need to know this. You know, we need our future doctors and medics, but that can't be everybody. And we need to be much broader than that. So we didn't actually find very many references even just to plant science at all, never mind worrying about soil. So we draw on some wider theoretical frameworks here as well, which are quite digestible actually. And we've tried to pull that apart for some of the people that we speak to at conferences. So again, right, what John's saying there, the overlap is stark, but maybe through a slightly different lens in the purely sort of education world of young people who were preparing to come in to a higher education. So that this notion of technological expansion and environmental degradation, and very much so a call for back to basics. If we don't really know and understand and have the skills to be in nature and be in outdoors and really think and critically think about what we're learning and what we're being told is knowledge and good knowledge and what we're being told is important to know about, if we don't challenge that, then this is all just going to perpetuate. And as John said, our attention's getting pulled away with technological expansion, which has its place and it could play a part, but I don't think it's going to save the planet really. So, you know, it very much so feels like we're pulling in opposite ways here. We're pulling in, whereas we should be working together. So we've tried to talk to people about that as well at conferences. And then I can share this is published, where we've looked at critical eco-literacy. So this would be another one of the overarching ones, you know, along with the thinking skills and personal capabilities. This threads through every single program that anybody could be taught ever, anywhere, at any level. Can we put that critical lens in front of this knowledge that we're just given, regardless of what stage we're learning at? And I've chosen the most kind of modern take on this around social media. And this came up from talking to young people. This notion came from talking to young people, like young people who couldn't understand why, you know, the main influencers on their TikTok accounts and their Snapchat accounts were around makeup. And they were like, why aren't the main influencers talking about the environment? Why aren't the main influencers challenging what we're being taught? And why we have to learn that stuff and not everything, all roads lead to the environment and all roads lead to our plants and our soil and, you know, the very reason why we're all alive. So these tables are quite stark in terms of social media engagement and in terms of some of the sort of skills and capabilities that are going to be required amongst our young people. So knowledge has its place, but their knowledge is right here. So how do they work out what's good knowledge and what should we be taking at face value, and how do we challenge those people who decide what our knowledge is? So in terms of this is not new information, and this comes from what young people are asking for in terms of their rights as well. So I'd like to direct you, probably already heard the general comment 26. So I think John's on that panel as well. There's some young people who are organising events around this. And that notion of looking at that bigger picture, and all of this stuff goes across all of our faculties, all of our programs. It doesn't really matter which program you're in. It's going to take everybody pulling together in every subject, and it is possible because we can have solutions-oriented, future-thinking, project-based work in almost every degree. If we were to sit down and look at every degree, we can see that work there. We can definitely see where it could be embedded. It's going to take a wee bit of time, but that doesn't mean that we should shy away from it and avoid it as well. So I know there's some excellent work happening within the university on this as well, where people are trying, you know, to map what's happening across our degree programs and the types of things that we can be doing. So on that note then, I suppose, you know, I talked about this the last day, And we hear this a lot where we can each individually take action. I'm sure many of you guys are committed already by virtue of the fact that you're in a group like this. So, you know, you're committed to ESD, you're committed to thinking about soil education, you're committed to thinking about environmental education and the wider picture. So many times I go to things and I'm sort of talking to the converted, you know, many people are already doing all this. But in terms of your power and your agency, you're in quite an influential position because you're a registered student of Queen's at the minute. So what can you do? You know, and yeah, we hear about activism and all of that has its place in supporting young people to take those activist approaches, but you do have a voice, and the people at B have to listen to that voice as well. So how do you go about that then? Well, feeding back constantly amongst your peer groups, amongst your friends and projects like this, and leaving your stamp on the university and the people that make the decisions around the knowledge and the people that make the decisions around what you should be learning about and being assessed on, all the time, feeding back. And I encourage my students to do the same, and that has helped us to frame what the PGC looks like as well. You know, they want to be prepared to prepare young people for living on a damaged planet and for living with the planet that we're on at the minute. And yes, managing everyone's mental health. So we do talk about strategies around that and around eco-anxiety and eco-grief, but we can't shy away at the same time. And our young people want to know how to cope with this and they want to know what to do. So this has just been very recently published by Advance HE, which is sort of like a benchmarking thing that academics are supposed to work alongside in order to improve the programs and to think critically about the programs that we deliver and the ways in which we deliver things and the opportunities that we make available to our students in higher education. And it's very clear that everybody has their part. So the institution has its part. Our educators, as in people like me, we have our part to play. And then there's yourselves, you have a little part to play as well, instead of just being the receptors of all of this. So I can share this document, no problem. And you know, many of your lecturers will be aware of this Advanced HE material at some point. If they're not, you can make them aware. So in terms of an institution, we're supposed to be thinking about being a civic university, and there are actions happening there. But again, we have to question, are they the right actions and are they planet centered? And in your case, is soil education in there? The quality assurance. So who decides what's quality and who decides what's in those programs, and how do we feedback? And there are quality assurance mechanisms. There are feedback mechanisms, and we have to seek those out and make sure that we're pushing that forward to those people who make the decisions. Staff development is happening, but there's no reason why you can't recommend that more staff are trained in very much so helping us to live and think about solutions oriented and future thinking and all of those lovely things around the environment and the planet. And the notion of a sustainable university needs to move beyond our recycling bins and all of that. And yes, we need to lay it at the door of estates and how we build things and how we grow the university, etc. But we also need to lay it at the door of everybody who's teaching the material in the university, that there is sustainable development in there as well. We're sending out graduates into a world that we don't really know what it's going to look like in 5 years' time. We don't really know what we're going to need to be able to do in workplaces everywhere, regardless of whether you're a teacher or an economist or you're on Wall Street. In fact, I argue you've got a very powerful voice there, or whether you are a farmer going into farming, or whether you are a nurse, a doctor, whatever it is that you're going to be doing, it needs to be interdisciplinary, and that interprofessional learning needs to go with us. Stakeholder engagement is very important. So are there people that we could be working with in the real world? Those people who are going to be your employers. Is there any way we can be bringing some really good advocates there and involved in our programs as well to help bridge that gap between the learning of knowledge in academia and then what we actually have to do when we go out into the real world and the decisions that need to be made within the parameters and the constraints within our employers will eventually have and are increasingly more so being held accountable for. So then in terms of us, we also need to be held to account as educators as well, with a future focused, as I've just said, curricular, mapping these things out, and a co-creation is a really interesting piece, and I've tried to do a bit of that with PGC students as well. What would be of most value for you? So they go out in placement, they see what skills are like, they see the challenges, they're working with people, trying their best, clinging on in some skills to meet those challenges, So, you know, what can we do as a university then to help develop a programme that prepares everybody for the reality in school, I guess? We can model all of those collaborative approaches, and it's very important that we're evaluating all the while what we're doing. And we are connecting ESD to some of the bigger global challenges as well. And many of the organisations I'm involved with are trying to do that. But, you know, we need to be continuing the push at the university to do that too. And there's no surprises here that these are the things that we are supposed to be helping our graduates to develop before they leave the university, our students. And you can see the threads run right through there, so I'll not repeat those. You know, that ability to critique and have that critical eco-literacy, and hold people to account for what's being delivered and what's being accepted as the norm and what's being accepted as knowledge and where it's come from, and to what end. As John's saying, you know, to the end where there of growth, and it's not sustainable. It's more not going to cut it if we continue with this notion of growth and incessant competition for resources and all of that. So yeah, so just some food for thought, some helpful documents. I can share anything else that you would find useful, that, you know, in terms of publications, book chapters, and some of the other sort of pieces of work that I'm doing in different organisations and things too, if that would be helpful. I'm happy to take any questions.
It would certainly be helpful for the project actually as well, to be able to share that with some of our international colleagues. I'm just thinking if we maybe take that down, then we can see
Yep, no
the
problem.
rest of the panel as well.
No, not my one. This one. All right. Okay. Yep.
Oh, yeah.
Is that okay
Still
now?
there. Yeah.
Still there? Yep. Grand.
Yeah.
I'll take this away actually here.
So I'm just going to unpin you, if you know what I mean, or unpin us so that everyone
unpin
can,
us, sorry.
yeah, everyone can be seen. So, jeepers, that was a whistle-stop tour
Yeah.
over
I'll share the slides as well.
over a huge range of things. I'm wondering, does anybody have any questions?
We're all writing furiously.
Yeah. And I think it's just so much to take in and think about actually, that I'm just wondering if there's anybody has a burning question. Because there was one thing you spoke about, Karen. I'm just wondering.
I think we might need an interdisciplinary module.
I know. Oh, yeah. that's something I have been pushing up for
I'm trying.
years.
Yeah.
You mentioned something that you and John were involved in, General Comment 26. Is that in
Yeah.
Queen's, or is it?
No,
I
that's
haven't heard
with
of it.
Nikki, Northern Children's Commissioner. So
Oh, right,
yeah,
right.
it's a group of young people organising an event
Uh-huh.
around the General Comment 26. So
But what is it? Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Maybe other people know this. What is the General Comment 26?
so United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. So this is
right,
General
right.
Comment 26 about the environment.
Yeah.
And young people's rights, basically.
Right. So it's that broader framework.
It's broader framework.
Yeah, I get it. I'm just wondering, John or Rachel, like now that everyone has spoken, is there sometimes there's something you want to come back and say, because I'm just conscious we're kind of down to the last few minutes. And I know you probably both have things to go on to as well. I'm just wondering, because sometimes when you've heard other people speak, and I know we find that in the other panels, people then have something that they want to come back and say. I'm just wondering if there's anything for either of you. Have you come off mute there, Rachel?
I'd like to say that I have no idea who the students are in the room. And I'm kind of intrigued by being in this situation where the interface means that we're not kind of able to connect. But I'm kind of interested in knowing how they relate to soil, you know, and if anyone would like to kind of comment on their relationship with soil and how they came into that relationship, what they do with that relationship, what they'd like to do with that relationship, whether they've actually taken anything from the various sessions that has helped them think about soil differently.
Well, do you know what? If you're okay with it, what I might do is stop recording and then see if anyone has something they'd like to say, because we were recording the panel sessions, but we weren't recording the student workshops. I'm just wondering, before we do that, is there anything that either of you would like to say while we're kind of finishing out the webinar part?
Perhaps just one thing for people to remember is the importance of both energy and land and soil, is that, you know, it's possible for us as a species to live in maybe a post-industrial society. We can never live in a post-agricultural one. But now soil in relation to the climate crisis, it's not just the source of our food system, but actually it's a nature-based solution for addressing the need for sequestering carbon. So something that we've not taken seriously, or we, particularly those of us live in the global north, where we're not so intimately connected with the land and the food system. I think we need to recognize and reconnect with the importance of the soil, both for food and agriculture, but also, as I say, particularly as nature's way of helping us solve the climate crisis in terms of sequestering carbon.
I'm wondering, do you have anything you want to say before we close off this?
No,
Karen?
no.
Well, then it just remains for me to say thank you all very much for the time that you've given to the project here. It has been incredibly helpful. This will be shared obviously within the project team and more widely on our website too, so more people will also benefit from the kind of the resources and the information and the learning that you've shared here. So thank you all very much for that, and I will just stop the recording now.